I never imagined my marriage would collapse not from betrayal or infidelity, but from a single word. No. For weeks, my mother-in-law had turned my home into a courtroom. Every towel I folded was wrong. Every dinner I cooked was rabbit food. Every hour I spent working was proof I was a failure as a wife. And my husband, he stayed silent, nodding along, shrinking into the obedient son she had raised. That morning at 7 o'clock, she stormed into my bedroom. Her voice ripped through the silence, barking orders, hurling insults, demanding I serve. Behind her, my husband stood watching, silent, as if I really was her servant. And that was the moment something inside me snapped. I realized I wasn't living in a home. I was trapped in a battlefield. This is my story, the story of how humiliation turned into strength, and how the woman they tried to break became the one who walked away victorious. And this is where it begins.
This isn't just a story, it's a confession, whispered into the dark. If you leave your mark or comment, I'll like it shows the Redditor-X-Tales family you were really here listening. And when you subscribe and tap the bell, you're not just supporting this channel, you're helping this story find someone who truly needs it. We at Redditor-X-Tales are grateful you're here.
My name is Mee Cooper. I'm 34 years old and I work as an interior architect. For the past 8 years, I've designed both private homes and corporate offices. I studied at an art college in Boston, then spent several years in New York, building my career among skyscrapers and the relentless rhythm of the big city. Eventually, I returned to Denver, seeking peace and a chance to create something of my own. My husband, David Cooper, is 36 and works as a sales manager for a building materials company. We met 4 years ago at a professional event. At the time, he seemed reliable, calm, a man I could build a life with. Everything began 3 weeks ago. David's parents, Margaret and Robert Cooper, came to visit. Margaret, 62, was a former history teacher who had spent her entire life lecturing and controlling everyone around her. Robert, 65, a retired factory mechanic, had long accepted that his wife was always right. They were supposed to stay just for the weekend. But when a pipe burst in their apartment and the repairs dragged on for weeks, their short visit turned into an endless ordeal. From the very first day, the atmosphere in our 2-bedroom apartment felt tense, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Margaret immediately assumed the role of hostess. She wandered through the rooms, scrutinizing my work materials, my open design projects on the desk, the books stacked on the shelves. Disapproval filled her eyes. To her, my profession was nothing more than a frivolous hobby. A real woman, in her opinion, should be cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Robert backed her up silently, though his silence spoke volumes. When I served him a light dinner, baked fish with vegetables, he pushed the plate away and frowned. To him it wasn't food but rabbit grass. He was used to fried chicken, steaks, and potatoes dripping with butter. My attempts to explain the benefits of healthy eating ran into a brick wall of incomprehension. But the most painful part was watching how David changed in his parents' presence. Just a month earlier, my husband had supported my career ambitions. Now he seemed to shrink into the role of an obedient son. Margaret had always been a strict mother, and David had feared her disapproval since childhood. She had helped him get into college, later gave him money for his first car. That financial and emotional dependence had never faded. So he nodded along when Margaret criticized me. He agreed when Robert said a woman's place was in the home. The man I had shared a bed with for 2 years suddenly felt like a stranger. Every morning I woke up with a weight in my chest. Our apartment, once a warm and safe haven, had turned into a place of constant tension. The moment I stepped out of the bedroom, I met Margaret's disapproving gaze. The smell of coffee on the kitchen counter mixed with an atmosphere of judgment. Even the silence at my desk was broken by their whispering, discussing how I wasted my time. My work began to suffer under the weight of this pressure. Concentrating grew harder each day. Exhaustion and irritation drained my strength. Clients noticed I was less attentive to details. Projects that once inspired me now felt unbearable. I went to bed late, woke up exhausted, and each day became nothing more than survival inside my own home. David didn't notice my pain or pretended not to. When I tried to talk to him privately, he brushed me off, saying his parents would leave soon, that I just needed to endure. He didn't realize that every extra day of their presence destroyed something vital inside me. He didn't understand that I was losing myself in this constant flood of criticism and disapproval. Margaret always found new reasons to scold me, though she wrapped every word in concern. If I folded towels the wrong way in the bathroom, she insisted she only wanted to teach me how to keep a proper home. If I spent too much time at the computer instead of cleaning, she reminded me that a clean house is essential for a happy marriage. Every word was a needle. If I brought home groceries, she found fault in my choices but smiled sweetly and said she only worried about our health. She collected my mistakes the way some people collect stamps, writing them all down in a little notebook she carried everywhere. Robert spoke less, but his presence was just as suffocating. He sat in our living room, watching baseball on TV, shouting at the screen so loudly I couldn't concentrate on work. His constant finger tapping on the armrest of the chair drove me nearly insane. When I asked him to turn the volume down, he gave me a look of pure contempt. To him, I was just a spoiled girl who didn't understand real life. I turned to my old habit from college, keeping a diary filled with architectural sketches and personal notes. Every evening, I poured my thoughts onto the pages, drew plans for imaginary houses built just for me, released all the words I couldn't say out loud. It was my only refuge in those suffocating days. On those pages, I could exist without their judgment. But even that sanctuary wasn't safe. One day, I found Margaret sitting on my bed, reading my diary. She held my most intimate possession in her hands, flipping through the pages as if she were reviewing evidence at a trial. My private thoughts, my fears, my dreams of freedom all laid bare before her. When I protested, she calmly replied that she only wanted to understand what I did all day. In her mind, she had every right to control everything that happened in her son's home. That was the breaking point. I realized I could no longer endure it. I couldn't live in a house where I wasn't respected as a person. I couldn't remain married to a man who refused to defend me against humiliation. Something inside me snapped, and I made a decision. I knew one thing: if from here things would only escalate. That day began like a sentence handed down at 7 in the morning. I had worked until 2 a.m. on a corporate office project. The client demanded last-minute changes, and the deadline was breathing down my neck. My eyes burned with exhaustion, my fingers ached from strain, but I finished the job. The few hours of sleep I managed over the past days were nowhere near enough to recover. And just when I finally slipped into oblivion, the bedroom door burst open with a crash, as if burglars had broken in. Margaret, my mother-in-law, stood on the threshold in her bathrobe, her face blazing with righteous fury. Her voice shook with indignation as she unleashed the torrent of accusations she had been storing up all this time. 7 in the morning, and I was still in bed. How dare I be so irresponsible with my family duties? The apartment was supposedly a mess, though I had cleaned it the night before. Breakfast wasn't ready, though no one had ever asked me to cook at such an hour. David would be leaving for work hungry, though my husband always fixed his own toast and coffee. Her words pelted me like hail. Each sentence struck my already frayed nerves. My heart pounded from the shock of being wrenched awake, adrenaline mixing with despair. Pressed against the pillow, I felt something fragile tear inside me. Not a muscle, not a tendon, something far more delicate. My patience. Margaret didn't stop at criticizing my sleep schedule. She recited a week's worth of sins: folding the laundry the wrong way, using the wrong dish soap, ordering takeout too often instead of cooking. And yet she wrapped each barb in the disguise of concern. She only wanted to help me become a better wife. She wanted to teach me how to be a real homemaker. She was only worried about the health of our family. But her eyes said something different. They glowed with triumph. She had finally caught me vulnerable, exhausted, defenseless. At last, she could unleash all her resentment without fear of pushback. I was too drained to snap back, too disoriented to defend myself. When her tirade ended, the silence fell heavy, suffocating. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. Waiting for apologies, excuses, promises to change. Her silence demanded my surrender. I slowly sat up in bed. My hair was tangled, my pajamas wrinkled, my face surely pale as a ghost. And then something strange happened. Weeks of humiliation, all those swallowed insults, suddenly aligned into one clear picture. The last drop had spilled over the edge. Inside me, a coldness bred. Not anger, but ice. Crystal clear clarity. Enough. I looked Margaret straight in the eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice was unnervingly calm. Too calm. I told her she had 1 hour to pack her things and leave my home. That I would no longer tolerate her invasion into my life. That she had crossed every boundary. At first, she couldn't believe what she heard. Her face twisted with shock, then outrage. She shouted that this was her son's house, that she had every right to be there. That I was nobody to throw her out. Her voice shook with righteous anger, but beneath it, I heard confusion. She had clearly never expected resistance. But I was no longer listening. Something inside me had shifted forever in those few minutes. Fear was gone. The need to please had evaporated. Only iron resolve remained. I walked past her to the closet and began pulling out her suitcases. The noise woke the others. Robert, my father-in-law, appeared in the hallway, disheveled and confused. He mumbled something about what was happening, but, as always, instinctively took his wife's side. He repeated the same tired phrase about how a girl should respect her elders. His voice was groggy, but his submission to Margaret's authority was as firm as ever. Then David, my husband, stumbled out in his boxers, rubbing his eyes. Seeing me with suitcases and his mother screaming, he immediately defended her. Of course he did. How could I have expected otherwise? He spoke irritably about how none of us had slept, how we needed to calm down and talk things through. He reminded me that his parents were under stress because of their home repairs and accused me of overreacting. To him, the entire situation was just my hysteria, not weeks of suffocating humiliation. He couldn't see the atmosphere that was crushing me. And that's when I understood with absolute certainty my husband would never stand up for me. He would never protect me from his parents. He would never put our marriage above their approval. For him, I would always come second. The realization didn't hurt. The hurt had already been there in all the weeks when I still held on to hope. What remained now was a cold, sharp clarity. I knew exactly what I had to do. I looked at David and spoke the words that changed everything. My voice was quieter than usual, but each syllable landed with precision. I told him that if his parents didn't leave right now, then I would. Forever. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Even I hadn't expected myself to say them with such finality. The hallway was suffocating with silence. All three stared at me, stunned. Margaret was the first to recover and launch another attack, but her screams bounced off me like pebbles against stone. Robert muttered again about respecting elders. David tried to speak to me in a soothing tone, but I cut him off. I wasn't negotiating anymore. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't justifying myself. I was simply waiting for their decision. And in that silence, a new me Cooper was born. A woman who would never again allow anyone to trample her dignity. A woman who finally knew her worth. What I didn't yet realize was that this was just the beginning not of a quarrel, but of a full-blown war. The silence in the hallway thickened, as if the very air had turned solid. All three of them stared at me, their faces shifting from shock to utter disbelief. I stood in the middle of the family theater in wrinkled pajamas, hair disheveled, yet for the first time in weeks, I felt like the owner of my own life. Margaret recovered first. Her face flushed red, her eyes narrowed to slits. She tightened the belt of her robe and slapped her palm against the door frame so hard that the sound echoed through the apartment. Then she unleashed another wave of outrage, shouting that I was ungrateful, that she had tried to mold me into a worthy wife, and I repaid her with rudeness. She declared her son deserved better than a hysterical, selfish woman who didn't value family. Her voice carried not only anger but also confusion. Margaret was used to her authority being absolute. She had spent her life teaching, shaping, and controlling others. And suddenly someone had dared to defy her. Someone had told her no. That was beyond her comprehension. Robert, my father-in-law, shifted uneasily from foot to foot, but I saw his fists clench. He wasn't used to confrontation, preferring to hide in his wife's shadow, but this scene unsettled him. His clouded eyes revealed his disbelief. How dare this young woman tell them what to do? They were older, wiser, with decades of experience. Surely they knew best how a wife should behave. David, my husband, stayed silent the longest. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. In his eyes, I caught disbelief, irritation, and something else. Maybe fear. Fear that I might be more serious than he ever imagined. That my words weren't a passing outburst but the result of something long in the making. It felt almost surreal, watching their reactions from a distance, as though I were behind glass, observing a circus in which I was no longer the clown. Months of humiliation suddenly looked absurd. These people truly believed they had the right to dictate my life, to judge every action, to control every breath. Finally, David spoke. His voice was taut, stretched like a string ready to snap. He urged me to calm down, insisted we were all too emotional. He claimed his parents only wanted to help strengthen our marriage and that my reaction was irrational. For him, the real problem didn't exist. He saw only my overreaction. He couldn't see the humiliations, couldn't hear the venom in his mother's remarks. He didn't understand that this was a battle for my basic right to exist as a person in my own home. I listened to his speech and, to my own surprise, felt no pain. Once his words in defense of his parents would have cut me like a knife. Now they simply confirmed the fact my husband had chosen his side. And it wasn't mine. When he finished his sermon about compromise, I studied his face carefully as if memorizing it for the last time. And I understood that this was exactly what it was. The man I had loved, trusted with my dreams and fears, had turned away from me at the most critical moment. Not out of malice, not out of greed, simply because he was weak. I repeated my ultimatum, this time with details. I explained that this wasn't an impulsive outburst from an angry woman. It was the result of 3 weeks of humiliation I had endured while waiting for him to defend me. It was the outcome of being treated like a stranger in my own home, of living each day as a test I could never pass. My words hung in the air like lead. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but I silenced her with a gesture. I told her the time for discussion was over. They had 2 hours to decide. Either they left or I did. And if I left, it would be forever. I turned and walked into the bedroom. Behind me, voices rose in hushed tones, fragments of sentences, whispers. They were discussing me, my irrationality, my disrespect. But none of it mattered anymore. I hadn't delivered that ultimatum to win an argument. I had done it to learn the truth about my marriage. Half an hour later, David knocked on the bedroom door. He entered cautiously, as if approaching a caged animal. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he began speaking in a gentle, coaxing tone. He said we could work things out. His parents were willing to compromise. Margaret promised to criticize me less. Robert would keep the TV volume down. He spoke of these compromises as if we were dividing chores: who would wash the dishes, who would take out the trash. He didn't understand that the issue wasn't chores. It was my dignity. My right to live in my own home without standing trial every single day. So I asked him directly, could he put our marriage above his parents' approval? Could he make it clear to them that I was his wife, and if they didn't like how I lived, that was their problem, not mine? David fell silent. His face hardened into stone. He thought for a long time before finally revealing his true beliefs. Family, he said, was sacred. His parents had given him life, and he could never hurt them. A real wife, he explained, should find a way to get along with her husband's parents and not demand he choose between them and her. In that moment, I understood completely he would never change. To him, I would always come second to Margaret's opinion. I would always be the one expected to bend, to yield, to keep quiet, to be convenient. I told him that tomorrow morning I would leave the house and file for divorce. That the years of our marriage had led to one truth: I could no longer play a game in which all the rules were written against me. Those 3 weeks had been the final proof of what I had sensed for months, that there was no place for me in this relationship. David tried to argue, insistent I was destroying our family over trivialities. But his words no longer reached me. I was already far away in a future where I could finally breathe freely. And I had no idea that what awaited me was not just freedom, but trials I couldn't yet imagine. After I spoke the word divorce, the apartment turned into a battlefield where every breath was heavy with unspoken accusations. Margaret froze, her face struck as if by lightning. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, words refusing to form. Robert went pale and sank into a chair, his hands trembling of finally grasping the magnitude of what had just happened. David simply stared at me as though I had become a stranger overnight. I couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere of shock and silent outrage. Every second in their presence stretched into an hour. Taking only the essentials of my documents, laptop, and a change of clothes, that I packed a bag and walked out. Their muffled voices trailed behind me, but I didn't care to listen. Whatever they were saying no longer mattered. That day, I found refuge in a small hotel in downtown Denver. The room was tiny, with a view of the parking lot, but it had what my home no longer did: silence. Silence without reproach, without judgmental stares, without the constant weight of someone else's disapproval. For 2 days, I lived inside my own thoughts, adjusting to this new, fragile sense of freedom. Freedom was a strange companion, intoxicating and terrifying all at once. For the first time in months, I could eat what I wanted, stay up late watching movies, work without anyone questioning how I spent my time. Yet alongside the relief came waves of loneliness and uncertainty about the future. On the 3rd day, David texted me. He begged to meet, to talk, to find a solution. He swore he loved me and didn't want to lose our family. He suggested a cafe downtown, neutral ground where we could speak calmly. Part of me wanted to ignore him. Why me, when everything had already been said? But another part, the part that still remembered 2 years of shared laughter, our late-night talks, and the future we once imagined, demanded I give him one last chance. Maybe, without his parent shadow looming, he would finally see things through my eyes. The Café, Bluebell, sat in Denver's old district, nestled among antique shops and bookstores. I had always loved its cozy atmosphere: worn leather couches, dim lighting, the rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee. It was where we had shared some of our earliest dates, where we dreamed about a home of our own. David was already at a corner table when I arrived. He looked worn down, red-rimmed eyes, a wrinkled shirt, hair disheveled. Clearly, the last few days had not been easy for him. When he saw me, hope flickered across his face. But inside me, there was only emptiness. We ordered coffee and sat in silence, studying each other. In those 3 days apart, I felt as if I had gained a bird's eye view of our life together. I saw things I hadn't before: how I had grown quieter around him, how my opinions rarely matched his expectations anymore, how I had learned to be convenient instead of authentic. David broke the silence first. He started gently, telling me how much he missed me, how the apartment felt empty without my laughter, how he longed for our late-night conversations. His words sounded sincere, and for a fleeting second my heart wavered. But then he reached the point. His parents would be leaving next week. Their apartment repairs were nearly complete. Margaret promised to criticize me less. Robert agreed to watch television with headphones. Everyone, he said, was willing to compromise for the sake of saving our marriage. And that's when I knew he still didn't understand. He saw the conflict as a misunderstanding between relatives, something solvable with small adjustment. He couldn't see the system of humiliation I had been drowning in. He couldn't grasp that the issue wasn't about loud televisions or harsh words over dinner. The issue was that I had become a stranger in my own home. I tried to explain. I told him how his silence during his parents' attacks felt like betrayal. I reminded him that compromise only works when both sides are equal, but in our case, compromise meant only one thing. I was expected to adjust, to shrink, to surrender. David nodded, even admitted he should have defended me more often. He promised to be more attentive to my needs. But when I asked the crucial question, was he willing to put our marriage above his parents' approval, he went back to his rehearsed line about duty to the people who gave him life. To him, it was all just a matter of balance between loved ones. He truly believed love could reconcile everyone. He didn't see that for me. This wasn't about balance, it was about my right to exist as a person in my own home. There was no malice in his words, no calculation. Only sincere conviction that he was right. And that was what convinced me once and for all. We lived in different worlds of values. To him, family meant blood ties and duty to elders. To me, family meant a partnership of equals who protect and support one another. I had to admit the truth to myself. I loved a man who chose comfort over me. Who, in the critical moment, clung to the role of obedient son instead of protector husband. The thought no longer hurt, the hurt had already passed. What remained was the quiet understanding that divorce was inevitable. When our conversation ended, David made one final plea for me to reconsider. He insisted we could fix everything if we both tried. That love was stronger than temporary struggles. That it was a shame to destroy what we had built in 2 years. I told him my decision was final. That I would file for divorce tomorrow. That while the apartment would remain co-owned, we could never live together again. That each of us had the right to happiness, just not with each other. David tried to argue about financial obligations, about how the apartment was too expensive for one person, about the difficulties of dividing property. And in that moment, the truth pierced me. While our marriage was collapsing, his greatest concern was money. It was as if he had already accepted losing his wife but couldn't stand the thought of losing half the real estate. That conversation about square footage and mortgage payments convinced me completely the man who once loved me was gone. What remained was a tenant obsessed with his investments. I rose from the table, leaving my untouched croissant behind. My appetite had vanished the moment he began speaking. I told him, finally, that I bore no grudge, not against him, not against his parents. That we were simply incompatible people, and it was better to face that truth than to spend years suffering in a loveless marriage. As I walked out of the cafe, I glanced back. David sat hunched over the table, head bowed. His posture radiated defeat but not remorse. He had lost the battle, but he still didn't understand what it was about. And I had no idea that the hardest part of my story was still to come. I filed for divorce the very next day after our meeting at the cafe. The courthouse felt like a funeral, not of a person, but of an illusion. An illusion of a happy marriage. The clerk accepted the papers with indifference and informed me the process would take several months. Months that turned out to be more than enough to reveal who David Cooper, my husband, truly was. The first few weeks passed in deceptive calm. I rented a small studio in the Highlands, a bright space with large windows and minimal furniture. It smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Work was going well. My clients never noticed my personal upheaval. If anything, freed from constant household stress, I became more creative, more focused. Every month, I dutifully transferred my half of the mortgage payment into our joint account. $1,500, half of the $3,000 we owed on the Denver apartment. It was a significant expense for my new budget, but I knew until the divorce was finalized, we remained co-owners, and each of us had to carry our share. David, too, sent his share for the first 2 months. His payments arrived on time without delay. I even allowed myself to think briefly that maybe we could part ways civilly without unnecessary drama. How naive I was. In the 3rd month, his payment was late by a week. I texted him a reminder and received a curt reply about temporary financial troubles at work. He promised to cover it in the coming days. I believed him. After all, anyone could have a rough patch, and construction material sales weren't always stable. But days passed and no money came. I had to cover the full mortgage myself to avoid penalties from the bank. $3,000 in a single month. It was crushing, but I managed. I told myself next month would be better. Next month was worse. David went completely silent. His phone was unreachable, my messages unread. I tried contacting him through mutual acquaintances, but they all said the same thing. They hadn't seen him in weeks and knew nothing. Despair crept in quietly, like shadows at night. My modest savings dwindled with every passing month. I worked more, took on extra projects, cut corners wherever I could. The studio that once felt like a safe haven was turning into a prison of financial obligations. By the 4th month, the situation became critical. I simply didn't have enough to cover the full mortgage. I borrowed money from my friend and colleague, Sarah Collins. She handed me the cash without hesitation, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She knew things were spiraling out of control. That was when I decided to hire a private investigator. His name was Thomas Reynolds, a man in his 40s, with tired eyes and a cynical smile. He specialized in financial investigations and tracking down people who wanted to disappear. For $200 a day, he promised to find David and uncover what was happening with his money. The results exceeded even my worst fears. A week later, Thomas placed a folder of photos and documents on my desk. David hadn't disappeared at all. He was living comfortably in our apartment, still working at the same job, still collecting the same paycheck. And more, he had a new girlfriend, Ashley Morgan, a bartender from a downtown sports bar. The photos showed them together, glowing with happiness, dining in restaurants, strolling hand in hand, laughing in movie theaters. Ashley was my polar opposite, blonde, loud, with a laugh that made half the cafe turn to stare. In one picture, she smoked a cigarette with 2 fingers curled around it in a brazen, almost masculine gesture. David looked relaxed, carefree, as if the heavy weight of marriage to a discontent wife had finally lifted off his shoulders. But the most painful revelation came from the financial records. Thomas had managed to obtain David's bank statements in Colorado under certain circumstances. This is possible during an investigation. David wasn't broke. Far from it. Every month, he brought home around $4,000 after taxes, plus bonuses, plus commissions on large sales. The very month he claimed he couldn't pay, his account showed over $5,500 in deposits. He spent lavishly on dinners with Ashley, on gifts, on a weekend trip to Aspen. Meanwhile, he ignored his mortgage obligations, leaving me to carry the burden alone. This wasn't bad luck or temporary hardship. It was deliberate. A strategy designed to wear me down, push me into despair, and force me to give up my rights to the property. That betrayal, financial, calculated, cruel, was the last straw. I could forgive his emotional indifference, even his failure to protect me from his parents. But to rob me coldly, to exploit my sense of responsibility, that crossed every line. In that moment, the last spark of pity I held for David Cooper died. The rage that rose in me was not hot, reckless anger. It was cold, precise, controlled. Not a flash, but a steady fire of revenge. David thought he could keep manipulating me even after our marriage ended. He thought I was weak, pliable, a woman who would rather lose money than face conflict. He was wrong. I studied all the possible ways forward. A lawsuit would mean months of battle, exorbitant costs, and an uncertain outcome. But I had another plan. A cleaner, sharper plan. One that would use David's arrogance against him. Thomas Reynolds wasn't just a good investigator, he had useful connections. One of them was a banker named Michael Davis, a specialist in distressed loans. Michael explained the intricacies of banking law to me, rules that could completely flip the balance of power. If one co-owner systematically defaulted on payments, the other could buy out his share not at market value but at the remaining loan balance. A bargain. Suddenly, the thought of justice glowed inside me. It could strip David of his claim and for much less than he thought it was worth. But to do it, I needed ironclad proof. Proof that his refusal to pay was deliberate, not due to hardship. Proof that it was malice, not misfortune. I already had photos of his spending. I had his bank records. I had the payment history showing how he had contributed without issue before suddenly stopping. But I needed more. I needed him caught in the act. And then the idea struck me. What if David confessed himself? What if I made him speak aloud the very motives he thought he had buried? The next stage of my plan was risky. But if it worked, it would be decisive. My plan required one crucial element of David's own admission that he was deliberately refusing to pay. Without that, it would all look like nothing more than a family quarrel over money. But if he spoke the words himself, if he confessed his true motives, it would become legally binding evidence. I spent a sleepless night turning over the details. Outside my studio window, rain trickled down the glass like tears I no longer shed. My heart beat steady, free of the feverish anxiety of past months. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a predator, not prey. In the morning, I wrote David a message. Simple, almost desperate. I needed to talk about the apartment. I couldn't carry the payments alone anymore. I was ready for any terms, anything, just to resolve it. My tone was pleading, almost pitiful. Exactly the way he expected me to sound. His reply came 2 hours later. He agreed to meet, even laced his words with a hint of sympathy. He suggested the same cafe at Bluebell where a month earlier we had buried our marriage. The irony was sharp. Now I would bury his financial schemes there too. Before the meeting, I stopped by Thomas Reynolds' office. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and strong coffee. His desk was stacked with folders, other people's dramas, revelations, victories, and defeats. He handed me a small device, no bigger than a thumb drive. A state-of-the-art recorder, he explained. It filters out background noise automatically. The audio quality is perfect for a court. 8 hours of continuous recording on a single charge. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, feeling its weight fuel my resolve. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. I chose a table by the window, ordered a latte, and sat facing the entrance. My hands trembled, and not from fear, but from anticipation. The way a hunter trembles before taking the decisive shot. David arrived on the dot. He looked pleased with himself, tanned, in a crisp new shirt, walking with confidence. Clearly, life with Ashley suited him. When he saw me, his face softened into a mask of condescending concern, as if he'd come to rescue his poor, lost ex-wife. We exchanged formal greetings. He ordered an Americano and settled across from me. With a subtle adjustment of my jacket, I switched on the recorder. My heart pounded in my throat, but my voice was calm as I began to speak. I told him about my financial struggles, how hard it was to keep up with the mortgage alone, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing the apartment, the debt I owed my friend. David listened with the satisfied look of someone hearing exactly what he wanted. When I finally asked the real question, why had he stopped paying his share, his answer surpassed my expectations. He didn't lie about job troubles or temporary setbacks. Instead, he spoke with startling candor. According to him, I was to blame for the divorce. My selfishness and a disrespect for his family had destroyed the marriage. Therefore, it was only fair that I bear the financial consequences. He had no obligation to pay for an apartment for a woman who chose to wreck a family instead of finding compromise with his parents. Every word was captured in crystal clarity. David went on, growing more reckless, not realizing he was sealing his fate. He admitted he had stopped paying deliberately to pressure me into reconsidering my priorities. He hoped financial stress would break me down, force me to apologize to his parents. In that moment, I felt a strange shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. Part of me still remembered the man I had once loved, and it hurt to see what he had become, a petty, vindictive schemer. But he wasn't done. He explained smugly that if I couldn't handle the payments, I could either carry the full burden alone or sell the apartment and give him half the proceeds. Either way, he would benefit. Real estate in Denver is only going up, he said with a satisfied smile, so I can afford to wait. I listened, and inside me bloomed a cold, victorious joy. He didn't even realize he had just shackled himself with his own words. He couldn't have given me a better gift for court. When his tirade ended, I feigned defeat. I nodded, pretended to accept his reasoning, even said I'd think about selling the apartment. David left the cafe satisfied, convinced he had broken me once and for all. On his way out, he even patted me on the shoulder, triumphant, patronizing, like a victor showing mercy to the conquered. If only he knew what had really happened at that table. Within an hour, the recording sat on Michael Davis's desk at the bank. He listened to it twice, shaking his head. Even in his line of work, he had rarely heard such reckless honesty. David hadn't just admitted to defaulting on payments, he had spelled out his motives, his plan, his strategy. The bank's lawyers confirmed the recording was more than enough to classify David as a willful defaulter. Even worse for him, his admission that he saw the apartment as an investment that would only appreciate proved he was acting out of speculation, not hardship. The paperwork took 2 weeks. I kept expecting David to find a loophole, some trick to turn it back on me. But everything went smoothly. The bank was eager to cut ties with a problem borrower and replace him with a reliable one. I bought out David's share at the loan balance, $35,000 below its market value. The day I received the deed in my name alone was one of the sweetest of my life. The paper smelled of fresh ink, and a warm wave of satisfaction coursed through me. Justice had not just been served, I had delivered it myself. David only found out when he received the official notice. First, he refused to believe it. Then he tried to challenge it through a lawyer. But the cafe recording was damning. No judge would side with a man who had openly confessed to sabotage. His messages came in floods of threats, accusations, demands. Sometimes he insisted the apartment was still his. Other times he appealed to fairness. And sometimes, pathetically, he begged to start over. But the next message would always return to rage. His tone swung wildly, betraying his panic. The man who had once controlled everything was now powerless. And each word only confirmed that I had done the right thing. Finally, he showed his true face, and not weak but kind, as I had once believed, but calculating, manipulative. I didn't reply. I didn't even block his number. I liked watching his anger, his despair. After months of humiliation and financial torment, it was my small revenge. The apartment was mine again. But it was more than property now, it was a battlefield I had conquered. Every room still remembered our drama, but those memories no longer hurt. They warmed me with triumph. And yet my revenge story was not over. What awaited me next would surpass even my expectations. My victory over David was only the beginning of my true rebirth. The apartment was mine again, but now every room breathed freedom instead of memories of humiliation. I spent 2 weeks erasing the traces of that old life, throwing out furniture that reminded me of our marriage, painting the walls in soft sand tones, buying new curtains and plants. Work thrived like never before. Free from constant stress and family battles, I found the creative energy I had been missing for so long. Clients noticed the change. My projects grew bolder, more original, more personal. I no longer feared proposing unconventional ideas. I no longer worried about what others thought a proper woman should be. A month after the paperwork was finalized, I finally blocked David's number. His messages had become less frequent, but there still came a toxic mix of threats, pleas for forgiveness, and attempts to stir pity. The final click of a block contact was quiet, but to me it sounded like fireworks celebrating my freedom. The real turning point in my personal life came unexpectedly. I was working on the renovation of a historic mansion in Cherry Creek when I met its owner, Thomas Reynolds, a real estate attorney. Yes, the same private investigator who had helped me expose David. It turned out that beyond investigations, he also invested in properties, and he had purchased this mansion for restoration. Our connection began with business meetings but quickly grew into something more. Thomas was the complete opposite of David, independent, decisive, capable of protecting what mattered to him. In his eyes, I saw respect, not an attempt to reshape me into someone else's standard. He admired my strength, my ability to stand my ground, my professionalism. He even had an endearing flaw. He always forgot umbrellas and ended up drenched in the rain, each time acting surprised. For the first months I was cautious. The wounds of betrayal were still fresh, the fear of misjudging someone lingered. But Thomas showed endless patience. He never pushed, never demanded I explain my fears. He was simply there when I needed him. Our dates took us to cafes and galleries, to hikes in the mountains around Denver. Thomas loved photographing Colorado's landscapes and kept a small blog about his adventures. On weekends, we climbed to scenic overlooks where the city below looked like a toy model and our problems seemed just as small. It was during one of those hikes, sitting on a rock as the sky turned pink and gold with sunset, that I realized I could trust again. Thomas spoke about his plans to expand his business, his dream of building a mountain home, his desire to travel. He didn't try to fit me into a pre-written script. He spoke of the future as a space of possibilities, but one that included both of us. 6 months after we met, Thomas asked me to move in with him. His home in the Highlands was bright and spacious, with panoramic windows and a terrace overlooking the city. But most importantly, it held no ghosts of the past. Every corner breathed of new beginnings. Moving in was easier than I expected. The apartment I had fought so hard for no longer held me. It had served its purpose, a symbol of my victory over those who tried to break me. Now it became an investment property rented out each month, bringing me steady income, a living reminder that justice had prevailed. Thomas and I didn't rush into marriage. We both valued independence, both believed in equality. But when, a year later, he proposed, I said yes without hesitation. Not because I feared loneliness, not because of social pressure or expectations, but because with this man I felt entirely myself. Our wedding was small, just close friends and colleagues at a restaurant with a mountain view. No relatives on either side, no compromises with traditions that didn't fit us. I wore a simple white dress I chose myself, without anyone's approval. Thomas read vows he had written himself, each word filled with sincerity. On our wedding day, I received a message from an unknown number. Somehow, David had learned of my marriage and decided to congratulate me. The message was a bitter cocktail of resentment, anger, and something that almost resembled regret. He wrote that he realized his mistakes, that he was sorry, that he wished me happiness. I showed the message to Thomas. He read it, shook his head, and suggested I block the new number. But I chose differently. I replied with a short message. I thanked him and told him I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I no longer needed to carry the weight of resentment in my heart. 3 years have passed since that morning when Margaret burst into my bedroom with accusations. Now, sitting on the terrace of our home, watching Thomas water flowers in the garden, I can hardly believe I am the same woman who once feared leaving her bedroom in her own apartment. Sometimes I hear fragments of my past through mutual acquaintances. David married Ashley, the bartender. They had a child, but they rent their home they can't afford to buy. Margaret and Robert still live in their renovated apartment, though their health has begun to falter. This news stirs no gloating, no pity. Only acknowledgement of lives that once intersected with mine. My rental property in downtown Denver continues to provide steady income. Tenants come and go, but the payments never fail. That apartment became the foundation of my financial independence, the independence I fought so hard to secure. Thomas and I are now planning to open a joint design studio. He handles the legal and investment side, I handle the creative. For the first time in my life, my plans need no one's approval. The woman who once endured humiliation for the illusion of family peace is gone forever. In her place stands another me, strong, independent, self-aware. A woman who will never again let anyone dictate her life. A woman who no longer seeks revenge because she understands the best revenge is a happy life lived without those who tried to break you. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the mirror and wonder, what would have happened if I had kept silent? If I had continued to swallow the insults, hoping for peace that never came? I know the answer. I would have disappeared inside a life that wasn't mine. A life scripted by others, not lived by me. And that's why the greatest victory wasn't taking back the apartment or exposing David's lies. It was reclaiming myself. My revenge has ended. My happiness has begun.
Hey. That's it. Today's story comes to an end. And honestly, thank you from the heart of the Redditor-X-Tales family for staying with us until the very last word. We at Redditor-X-Tales love to know what you think really. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all. And trust me, your words mean more than you realize. If you're hungry for more, the full playlist is waiting in the description. And don't worry, new true stories are already on the way. The Redditor-X-Tales family can't wait to share them with you. If this journey touched you even a little, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the next story. Once again, thank you for listening. Until next time, take care.